Hello and welcome to this lecture on the Mongols in Russia and the Battle of the Kalka River. To understand this campaign, and particularly how it came about, we need to go back to the 1220s and to Genghis Khan's campaign against the great power of Central Asia in his day, the Khwarizm, who were a settled people living in modern-day Iran, Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. You'll remember from our discussion of the life of Genghis Khan that this came about because of the leaders of Khwarizm executing Mongol ambassadors, which was taken as an act of war by Genghis, and he then proceeded to advance on a very bloody campaign that ended up defeating the Khwarizm, driving their leader Shah Muhammad into Afghanistan, where he was eventually killed. This left the Mongols with a major military force in the western part of modern Iran. So between 1222 and 1223, this army continued westwards into the area around the Caspian and the Black Sea, the modern Crimea. In 1222, the army settled into winter pastures along the modern Iran-Azerbaijan border, and the major general of the Mongol forces, Subadai, received his orders for a spring attack north into the territory of the Polavytsian Khanate. He was going to attack them from the rear, convince them to join the Mongol alliance of all the nomadic peoples, and then he would return to Central Asia. The problem was that as he was being led through the mountainous regions, his guides, who he'd either hired or coerced, took him into terrain where the Mongols couldn't operate effectively. So Subadai, recognising that he was not at the military advantage anymore, sent an embassy to the Polavytsians to make a peace. He wasn't sincere in this peace, however, because once the truce was signed, he marched north and destroyed the Polavytsian Khanate in a surprise attack. That winter in 1223, the Mongols settled into the central plains of the Crimean Peninsula, modern-day Ukraine. And the leader of the Polavytsians, along with the refugees from his city, found shelter with one of the Russian princes, who was in fact his father-in-law, Prince Mstislav Mstislaevich. The Prince Mstislaevich was so concerned about the stories that he heard from the Polavytsians that he organised a meeting of all of the different princes who previously couldn't stand the sight of each other and were at each other's throats, and they met in Kiev. The princes had a debate, which is recorded by the Novgorod Chronicle, expressing that they were both fearful of the Mongols, but also fearful of the Polavytsians changing over to the Mongol side. The Novgorod Chronicle reports that they didn't know who these Mongols were. They were unknown tribes who came from where no one knows. Who they were, or what their language was, or what their race was, or what their faith was, no one knew. But they called them Tartars, people from Tartarus, people from hell, the riders of Satan. The Mongols sent the princes of Russia an embassy. They wrote to them, "We did not occupy your land, neither have we done anything to your towns and villages. We have no quarrel with you. We only have a quarrel with the Polavytsians." The Russians, though, feared that the ambassadors were spies, and so had them executed. This, of course, showed their lack of understanding of the Mongols and what a grave offence this would be against the Yasa of Genghis Khan. The Mongols sent a second embassy, which arrived and tried to make peace. But when this was refused, delivered a declaration of war, that if the Russians supported the Polavytsians, killed the ambassadors, and march against us, know that we did not attack you, and that God will be our judge. So the Mongols advance towards the heart of the Russian princely kingdoms, towards the city of Kiev. At the same time, the Russians assemble their forces along with some of the Polovitzian refugees who have joined them, and begin a march to the east. The Russians move across the Dnieper River, and the Mongols, who have really only got a scouting force at this point, start to retreat east. In the process of this retreat, one of their generals, Gemyabek, is captured after having taken refuge in a fortified tomb, which you can see in this picture. He was wounded, and his soldiers buried him up to his neck in an attempt to hide him so they could come back later and rescue him. But the Polovitzians identified him to the Russians and had him executed. It's at this point we should probably remind ourselves of the differences in equipment between the Mongols, who are much more lightly armoured than most of the heavy Russian troops. And it's from these campaigns in Russia that we have most of our archaeological evidence. Arrowheads, quivers, shields, helmets, and so on. It's at this point as well that the Mongols, having successfully conquered parts of northern China and the Khawarizm, have begun to adopt some heavier armour and protection for themselves from the spoils of war. But the Russians also had heavy troops, particularly units of the prince's bodyguard, the Druzhina, who had very good chainmail, helmets, fine swords, shields and axes. And it's usually these troops who we see illustrated in the books or reenacted by enthusiastic people. But most of the Russian army, in terms of numbers, wasn't these professional soldiers. It was peasants and townspeople who were given a spear or bought their own pitchfork and fought as directed by their lord. They didn't necessarily have the discipline, training or equipment for the nasty kind of warfare that the Mongols were involved in. The Russian army also moved rather slowly, both because it had a mixture of cavalry and infantry, but because the nobles didn't like to carry all their weapons and armour. It was hot, it was heavy, so they used carts to transport their supplies and equipment. The Mongol forces kept moving eastward, but there was a debate amongst the Russians about what they should do. The Russians became confident that they could beat the Mongols, but they fell to quarrelling over exactly how this should be achieved. Should they make the Mongols fight at the Dnieper, where the majority of their forces were? Should they pursue them into the steppes? And they decided eventually to pursue them to the east, towards a place called the Kalka River. Here's what it looks like today on a good day. And this is where Subadai chose to meet them. If you go there today, it looks a bit more like this. It's still a battleground between the forces of Ukraine and the Russian-backed Ukrainian rebels. By the time the Russians arrived, they were exhausted from a 9 or 10 day march. And Subadai had the opportunity to scout this land and choose exactly where he wanted to meet them. In attacking the Mongols across the Kalka River, the key thing is that the Mongols staged a feigned retreat. The Mongols in this diagram are in red, the Russians are in blue. The Mongols' light armour and equipment meant that they could ford the river easily and quickly, and leave the Russians to come at them at their own time. The Russian force became divided. So there, some of the stronger units of the Druzhina, accompanied by Polovitzian cavalry, initially advanced, were the first units to advance across the river, which were then attacked unorthodoxly by the Mongols' heavy cavalry. The Mongols fired a rain of arrows before closing in to fight hand to hand. And our sources describe how some people were killed with spears and other people were wounded in the chest. And the Russian force starts to collapse and flee back across the river. They, as they start to turn though, are come upon by units of the Mongol force that they haven't recognised. They haven't noticed that they were there, and they're surrounded on their flanks. This makes it even harder for the Russians to make it across the river. Notice though that the army of Kiev is still on the western bank of the river. They haven't entered the fray at all. It appears that what they were doing was making a fort for themselves once they saw that this battle was going badly, out of their wagons. The Mongols continue to harass them, firing at them with their arrows, attacking them with their cavalry, until the Kievian force is exhausted. At which point the Mongols send an emissary in the form of one of the captured or turncoat Russian noblemen, and offer to exchange them for ransom, promising that no blood will be spilled. But as the Russians are leaving their fortification, the Mongols seize them and capture them. So by the end of the battle, the Russian force has fled both up and down the Kalka River, and many noblemen have been captured. The Mongols lose very, very few. At least 70 noblemen died. The Polovitsians continue their refugee flight onwards into Hungary. And this was really just the beginning of the Russian attack. In years to come, they wouldn't just fight in a rural area around the rivers, they would be attacking the cities. Many Russians were chased down and killed along the rivers or on the plains by the Mongols, but in the end, they were all brought together and joined the Mongols for tea, although it wasn't a very nice tea for the Russians because they were being squashed underneath this tea house that the Mongols constructed on top of their bodies. And this has become a famous image of Russian national spirit as they think about the noble endurance and suffering of their brave defenders and the barbarity of the Mongols. The Mongols withdraw at the end of that year, back eastward, and on the way attack both the Bulgars and the Turks. But they will be back. In 1237, Batu will launch a very strong campaign and conquer nearly all of the Russian principalities and continue on into Western Europe. So why were the Mongols successful and the Russians defeated? The first reason is the superior military organisation of the Mongols. The different Russian principalities with their different armies were lacking in the coordination of the Mongols, who acted as one force in combined arms, both heavy cavalry and light cavalry and archers. The Mongol generals controlled the battle magnificently and showed great discipline without exposing themselves to danger and thus losing control of their army. The second reason is the disagreement amongst the Russian leaders. The Kievians were always too far away from the battle and didn't take place in the fight. They might have been able to turn things if they'd got involved earlier. This shows the rivalry and mistrust between the different princes, which would become a pattern for their future attempts to deal with the Mongol attacks. The Mongols were able to choose the battlefield to suit their cavalry tactics rather than the Russians, who would have been better fighting from behind fortifications. Subutai and Jebe chose a perfect battlefield for their strategies. And the Mongols, in having the 9 or 10 day retreat, forced the Russians to march, become exhausted, and enter unfamiliar territory. There's always a common military maxim, never to fight with a river on your back, which is exactly what the Russians and their Polovitzian allies were forced to do in this case. The fourth reason is the poor reconnaissance of the Russians. The Mongols knew exactly where they needed to position their reserve troops so that they could appear unexpectedly and take out the Russians. The Russians had no idea that they were there. The Russians had no idea what the Mongol camp was like on the other side of the river, or if they'd even be able to make it back across. Fifth reason was the overconfidence of the Russians and the Mongol cunning. The Allies fell for this Mongol ruse of the false retreat and the easy victories in the early stages against the Mongol scouts, which bred a sense of superiority which the Mongols encouraged. It's fine to lose a battle, it's fine to lose a general, but the Mongols win the war. Without that initial attack, without that initial retreat, maybe the Russians would have been more cautious and set up better defences. The sixth principle is the divide and conquer that the Mongols bring about. A key principle of warfare is concentration of efforts. The Mongols were heavily outnumbered by the Russians, but fought the battle in a way where they were able to identify and combat particular units with the full strength of their army. The Polovitzians who'd come across the river and then turn their attention to those Kievians who'd stayed on the west bank. The Russians were never able to bring their whole force to bear and thus were crushed piecemeal one unit at a time, rendering their numerical advantage nothing. It was a defeat in detail.